Hello, and welcome to this special episode of History Matters, the podcast of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. The CIHE's mission is promoting historical literacy through research, education, and engagement in the public square. And we regularly host live events with historians, writers, and other thinkers who can help foster a deeper understanding of Canadian history in all its complexity. Today's episode is the second of two, taken from an event held in Toronto on March 1st, 2025, with Professors Nigel Biggar and Margaret MacMillan. Last week's episode, which I encourage you to listen to if you have not yet, featured an opening statement at that event from Professor Biggar. Today is a conversation between Nigel Biggar and Margaret MacMillan. Now over to the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've given us all a great deal to think about. We won't get to it all because you've raised so many important issues. But I think the notion that when we're doing a balance sheet, that we need to be reasonable about it and fair about it and look at the evidence is very important. And it seems to me that one of the things that is happening with history, and you're finding yourself in the middle of it because you have started to deal with the history, is that the more we think that history has some final version that we can all appeal to, the more we disregard evidence. It seems to me paradoxical. And I've been wondering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, why history has assumed this position of somehow being like an impartial judge. And whether that's because of other sources of authority, whether we believe less in our own elites, whether we believe less in our institutions, whether we believe less in our religions, we seem to give history a weight, as if it provides answers and surety. We talk about, it is clear that, or history will judge. Whenever I hear that, I think we're in trouble. Or history will, I want to be on the right side of history, as if history is some sort of impersonal force. And we know, and we've seen it in the past, and we're seeing it certainly today, and we saw it yesterday in the White House. We know that history is used, it's weaponized. It often isn't based on good evidence. It simply becomes a matter of opinion. And a great deal of what has been written on the history of empire, it seems to me, in recent years has become the case for the prosecution rather than an attempt to look at empire. I think the interesting questions about empire are, what did it do? How did it work? What was it like to be in it? How did people establish relationships? And there always were relationships. The British developed relationships with the Indians and vice versa. It was a complicated set of relationships. And understanding that, I think, is what we need to do. But I do find very worrying the way in which history is being used. It's used, I think, often for very bad purposes. It's used to mobilize one people against another. It's used to back claims for seizing a land from one of your neighbors. I don't know if you've read the infamous essay by President Putin called "The Ukrainians and Russians Are One People." I don't recommend it. You can find it, I think, we used to be able to find it on the Kremlin English language website. And if I were grading it, and I'm a very kind teacher, and so I would have said, good effort, Vladimir. You've obviously thought about this a lot, but you haven't really looked at the evidence, and you haven't offered any proof. And in fact, when you try and offer proof, you get it wrong. And this doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are somehow Russians and don't realize it. So Vladimir, I'm going to give it back to you rather than failing it. But would you please go and think about it again? But I think we have to take history very seriously because it can lead to such dreadful things, and it can lead to such evils. It can lead, and I think because of the authority which people invest in it, it can lead to these sorts of unfairnesses, actions of one person against another. I think we need to respect the past, but we need to look at the evidence. This is what you've been saying, both here and throughout your book. And I think some of the most interesting parts in your book are in the footnotes, the endnotes, where it's really look at them. Usually endnotes just refer to the source. You often will refer to a debate that is going on, and you have some very interesting things to say about the evidence that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission used. And apparently, I hadn't realized this, but one of the sources on empire they used was a book which is part of an Oxford series called A Very Short Introduction To. And they always have to be under 100 pages. And you pointed out that this was used heavily as one of the authoritative sources on empire, when it's only an introduction. And if you really want to know about empire, you have to do a bit more work. And so I'm grateful to you for wading into this, but how are you finding it? I mean, did you realize there were such history wars going on?
No, Margaret, I was completely innocent. Maybe because I'm not a historian, so I would have been more aware of the currents than I was. I mean, just to explain to folk briefly what happened, I mentioned the Ethics and Empire project that I and John Darwin launched in 2017, July, and this provoked a reaction in December when a scholar of post-colonial studies in Cambridge, Priyambada Gopal, tweeted to her political allies in Oxford the immortal tweet, quote, "Oh my God, this is serious, SHIT. We need to, black capitals, shut this down." I mean, I'm not unaccustomed to criticism, but that wasn't criticism. I mean, it was opposition, but it wasn't, as it were, Biggar, you're being an idiot for the following reasons. Can we discuss it? This was, Biggar needs to be shut down. That I wasn't expecting. And then, since then, people have often asked me, have you had any, as it were, fruitful discussions with your critics? And I racked my brains to think of one, maybe one or two. But most of my critics don't seem to be interested in a kind of give and take of reasons. In the paperback edition to my book, which I think is back there, I indulged myself by writing a postscript to the paperback edition, which is mainly comprises my responses to 10 of my most hostile critics. And one of them, the most obsessive, is a professor of historical geography at Sussex University called Alan Lester, who wrote a 15,000-word review of colonialism, in which 15,000 words, Alan could find nothing positive to say about the British Empire at all, and nothing positive to say about my book. Now, I don't want to be immodest here, but I've been around long enough to get some idea of my own quality. I can make mistakes, but I'm not stupid. And I know there was stuff in that book that deserves credit. I think even you might think so, Margaret. But Alan, for whatever reason, was so driven in 15,000 words, not a positive comment. Now, I mean, I want to, you're the historian, Margaret, you know these people. My perception is that there's a kind of generational difference. But what drives that kind of an unwillingness really to engage in the give and take of reason as you and I always thought was normal?
I've wondered about it. I think it's partly fear of their colleagues or to attain status among their colleagues.
Yes.
And a lot of it is performative. It's to show publicly that you are a good person and others are bad. And the pressure, as we know from social media, the pressure is always to go to extremes, to show that you're really good or really bad. I mean, this happens with tweets because of the algorithms.
So social media has exacerbated the problem.
Social media has definitely exacerbated. And you can go onto social media, and you must have encountered this. I'm sorry if you have, but I certainly have. And people will send very rude things and say rude things, which if they were facing me, I think they probably wouldn't.
Right.
I remember once I got involved in a slight controversy at Massey College, and I still think I was on the right side, as one does, but I got a whole series of abusive emails, including one that said, "You are so hideous, you should die. You're uglier than Homer Simpson." And my loving family, I said, "Look at this, isn't it awful?" And they said, "Yeah, you're not quite as ugly as he is." As they would. But I do think a lot of it's performative. It's to show that you are right. And again, it goes back to this thing, I think, of history being some sort of judge. But we're getting it in museums, we're getting it in art galleries. It's a sort of performative virtue. And it means that you don't listen to other people, and it means you make decisions about other people based on who they are. I mean, it's what racism does, really. I mean, a lot of people would look at us and say, well, they're old and they're white, so there's no point listening to what they say about empire because they don't know, you know, they have no right to talk about it. But as you point out, empire is probably the most persistent and common form of government throughout history. We thought it was over, and we're realizing yet again that it isn't. I mean, we're realizing it in Canada, that the age of empire is here, just south of our border. So, you know, it is, but I just think it's the reformative aspect, and it's virtue signaling.
But this, I mean, this signaling virtue wasn't common, I think, 20 years ago. And I'm wondering what's happened since then. I guess, one of the main reasons I wrote the book, and I didn't write it for, as it were, purely historical reasons. I read it because I realized how colonial history was being used, and in my view, abused to support political projects that I regard as destructive. I mean, I first noticed it in the referendum on Scottish independence in 2014. I'm Anglo-Scottish, as you may have gathered, and I'm a natural Brit. Don't call me English, thank you. Don't call me Scottish, I'm British. Both. But I felt obliged to look at the nationalist arguments to see if there were indeed good reasons why Britain should disintegrate. Because I don't think nations are forever. The UK didn't exist before 1707. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist in 1993. The US almost ceased to exist in the 1860s. But one argument I came across, I concluded, in case you're wondering, that Scottish independence is a dogmatic solution in desperate search of an adequate problem. But I came across one argument that had it that Britain equals empire equals evil, therefore Scotland needs to break away in order to purify itself of British sin and sail off into a sin-free, probably European future. But it was the political exploitation of history, and that I think is what infects a lot of the dogmatism, because some historians, they're not interested in a discussion, they're interested in shutting you down or provoking you into saying something on Twitter that's going to embarrass you forever. I think initially, Margaret, I was, again, naive. I always thought that I was morally obliged to respond to someone who addresses me in good faith, and discovered they didn't want a conversation, they wanted a fight. Yeah.
It is very interesting why it's happening. It's not happening everywhere either. No. And what's interesting, I wonder sometimes if part of it's the result of the cultural pull of the United States, which has enormous cultural influence, and race and the bad treatment of their own black population has been a central feature of American life, and quite rightly. And we take on those debates, and so do many parts of the world. And we've always, speaking as a Canadian, we've always had that sort of, what was the famous car advertisement, car rental, Avis, we're number 2, so we try harder. And so if the United States is wicked, we're even more wicked. But it's I think often the questions of empire are affected by concerns about race.
Absolutely. I think the decolonization movement really gained traction after the killing of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter. And just to your point, 2 points. First of all, there was a photograph of an English protester at an English protest on behalf of Black Lives Matter. She was holding a placard which said, "Disarm the police." Our police aren't armed in England. The other point is, 2023, a young first-generation Nigerian immigrant called Tomiwa Awolade arrived to study for a master's degree at University College London, I think, and found all his white British peers were obsessed with racism. And he looked around and he said, "Where is it?" And then he wrote a book, 2023, and the title is, "This is Not America."
I've seen a picture, actually, of Idlib, which was freed from Islamic State, and on a wall was Free George Floyd. Now, what George Floyd must have meant to anyone living in Idlib who'd been living under Islamic State, goodness only knows. But it is interesting because it seems to be mostly in developed democracies that there is this concern with empire and this guilt. You don't hear much talk about empire, interestingly enough, in Latin America. I mean, you used to a generation ago. It was
Yes.
customary to blame the problems in Latin America, for example, economic lack of development and so on the impact of empire. But that's gone. You don't hear much concern about empire in Asia. Occasionally the Chinese will use it as an excuse for doing something they're doing to their own people. You know, if you criticize China's treatment of the Uyghur, the Chinese government is likely to say, you know, you impose the opium wars on us, you have no right to talk to us. But they're using it as a weapon. Yeah. But it seems to be particularly in advanced Western democracies that there is this guilt and this concern with empire and this concern to decolonize, a word which I've never fully understood anyway.
No, I think it's more specific than advanced Western societies. It's English-speaking societies. So I think the influence of America is considerable. But I think there are also a kind of coincidence of different forces. There's the radical black politics imported across the border and the sea, which of course suits the purposes of professional anti-racist groups in England, who for their own purposes want to emphasize the fact that we are systemically racist and therefore need to decolonize. There's that. Then in addition, West Indian countries who are committed to claiming up to 18 trillion pounds worth of reparations for historic slavery have an interest in pushing this story. And of course, this is far-fetched. I mean, China and Russia have an interest in this kind of internal cultural strife in English-speaking countries. I have resisted speculating that it's actually Chinese-funded, but I did speak to a friend in Australia who deals with Australian intelligence services, and he says, no, they are active. I mean, this is speculation, but it does serve the interests of countries that want the West to be weakened, which again is the main reason I wrote the book, because I think we in the West, in the English-speaking West, need to have a balanced and fair view of our past. Let's be frank about the bad stuff our ancestors did. Let's make amends for injustices where it makes sense to make amends, but let's not cease to admire what our ancestors built, which was good and which we have inherited.
Well, I think if you look at the history of empire in India, for example, as you know well, Indians were moving into the three presidencies run by the East India Company because they were secure in their property. For example, they could start businesses. Same thing in Egypt. I once had a very interesting talk about entrepreneurs under the old Egyptian government before 1880. Entrepreneurs in Egypt never bothered to save their money because they knew it could be taken at any moment. So they simply spent it in lavish displays, which did not help the Egyptian economy and didn't help to develop Egypt. So that empires often provided a sort of stability and a rule of law, as did the Roman Empire.
Yes, and another example, you mentioned Indians moving into the East India Company territory. I once had a Chinese Hong Konger visit me in Oxford, and over dinner I turned to Ping Chung and I said, "Okay, Ping Chung, so what do you make of the colonial legacy in Hong Kong?" And he said, "Well, if China had been a liberal democracy, non-democratic Hong Kong wouldn't have looked so good. But in the 1950s and 60s, with civil war, anarchy and communism on mainland China, several million Chinese voluntarily voted with their feet and entered non-democratic Hong Kong, because in spite of the lack of democracy, at least it offered rule of law, stable institutions, and the environment in which to build a decent life." And he said, "My grandmother was one of them." And he said, she never learned to speak English, but she became a lifelong devotee of Princess Di.
One of the other things that is, again, interesting about empire, I think, and this is, again, not to defend it, but as you say, to try and understand its complexity, is that empires often treated their minorities much better than nation states. And the Ottoman Empire was much more tolerant of the minority religions of Christianity and Judaism than were nation states often.
Yes, yes. And that was one of the reasons, I mean, no doubt British people at the end of empire had their own selfish reasons for not wanting to let go of power. If you have power, it's quite hard to let go of it. But there were stated concerns, and I think there were genuine concerns about the plight of minorities in independent states. Because if you have an overarching imperial authority, it can moderate conflict between different ethnic minorities. And I mean, what happened in India on the eve of independence, 1947 with partition, the necessity for the movement of populations to prevent violence was a case in point. And I think it's often pointed out, you know, after the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was vanished and it was replaced by a host of independent states, on Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination, which makes sense in abstract, but in principle what that meant was you end up with all sorts of countries with isolated minorities. In Hungary you have pockets of Romanians.
Slovaks.
In Romania you have pockets of Hungarians who feel cut off. And that was a source of conflict.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm right, something like a third of all the peoples living in the center of Europe after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire and the Russian Empire were minorities in their own countries.
Is that right?
Yes, and it was a perpetual source of trouble because you get the majority, the Germans were constantly interfering and complaining about the Poles' treatment of Germans, for example,
Yes.
and of course the Sudetenland Germans became the excuse to break up Czechoslovakia. And that problem was solved in the most brutal possible way by murder and forced migration in the Second World War.
Yep.
Empires often held a ring. But I'm wondering if there's a sort of reverse, sort of Western elitism in this. I haven't got the right word. There is this tendency in the history of empire to blame the West for everything. You know, the British Empire was the worst thing that ever happened, and it's responsible. It's almost as if the argument is the West has so much power, or the British had so much power, that they bear responsibility for everything awful in the world that happened. And it seems to me that's simply not reasonable.
No, and it goes back to the point about the relative weakness of states in the 19th century, early 20th century. Colonial governments, in terms of resources, were very, very limited. And one reason for frontier violence in North America and in Australia was that the presence of government was so weak. For example, we all know about the violence between settlers and Native Americans in the 1870s, 80s, south of the border here. One of the reasons for the violence was that the US Army, after the Civil War, guess how many troops were in the US Army?
30,000?
I think about 40,000.
Yeah.
And there wasn't the same violence in Western Canada at the same time, partly because the number of settlers wasn't so great. But I think around that period, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which was in charge of Western Canada, not Ontario, and the East, had 1,000 men.
Yeah.
And you can say, well, they should have had more. And then the question arises, well, really? Funded by what? From where? So I think, one of the kind of sub-themes of my thinking about this, Margaret, is I'm just acutely aware of human limits. And I love that quotation of Joseph Chamberlain, 1900, during the Boer War, that we must lie on beds that other people have made for us. We don't get to start with a clean slate. Yeah. We have to somehow figure out how to make the best of this mess with the resources at hand. And so I've got a great deal of sympathy for people in government shouldering responsibility that academics like me, I won't say you, have built careers in avoiding.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I have too.
Sure, not your case.
I'm very good at avoiding. Karl Marx said something similar. He said, men make history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing.
Yeah.
And I think we make a mistake when we look back and we assume that the past is just like us. They were just like us. They should have been thinking the same things. They should have had the same ideas. They should have known how it was going to turn out.
Yeah.
And of course, you can't know that. I mean, it's been brought home to us again, I think, we're living through the middle of a very peculiar time, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. And people in the past didn't know how it was going to turn out, and they didn't always have the same values as us. We can deplore those values, we can approve of those values, but they're not the same. And without trying to understand the past on its own terms and understand the peoples of the past, we can't just sit here and judge them by the 21st century standards.
No, agreed. So one of the features of some history writing, the history writing we've been complaining about is the lack of humility, actually, the lack of human humility.
Yeah.
And I do find myself using the word tragic a lot. Surely we know from our own lives that often we have very good intentions, and we might even plan very carefully what we intend to do. Nevertheless, it all goes pear-shaped because of circumstances we couldn't control. And that's not an uncommon human phenomenon. It's certainly not uncommon in government, and not uncommon in colonial government.
Yeah. Well, and I think what we also tend to assume is that those who are the subjects of colonial government are thinking like we would think in the 21st century. We want self-determination. I mean, one of the interesting things about empire is, and my main sort of thesis was on the British in India, was just how acquiescent, for various reasons, a lot of the Indians were. I mean, the British never had that many people in India. There were probably at most 1,500 in the Indian civil service, which was sort of the backbone.
In 1900, there were 300 million Indians and a total of 164,000 Brits.
Yeah.
Tiny.
Yeah. And the British forces were never that big. And so empires were a collaboration. And that doesn't mean to say that those collaborating were in some sense traitors. They simply were working with what they had. And if you think of what the lives of most Indians were in the 18th and 19th centuries, they had no says in their own government.
No.
They had monarchical rule. And for a lot of people, their lives went on. They probably didn't know who was in the big capital far away. Life just went on. As India began to change, partly as a result of the British being there, partly as a result of the introduction of the English language, a press, railways, a sense of a nation began to develop. And the British did have to deal with that. But we can't assume that in the 18th century all Indians were longing to govern themselves. That's anachronistic.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, I mean, the question of whether it's always true that people prefer to be governed by their own people. Some people say a people prefers to be governed badly by people of their own race than well by people of another race. I'm not sure that's true, actually.
Yeah.
Because as you say, for most of history, most people were not directly involved in government. They had no power. And even today, although we can cast a vote, I mean, how many of us take an active interest in politics? So as long as our lives are going well enough, we don't want to be bothered with politics. And so the millions of Chinese people going to Hong Kong after the Second World War, they weren't expected to cast votes. They just wanted to get on with their lives.
Thank you all for attending today. Thank you to our guests. It's been a very enjoyable morning.
You've been listening to a special episode of History Matters featuring a conversation between Professors Nigel Biggar and Margaret MacMillan. Professor Biggar was the author of Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, published in 2023, and Professor Margaret MacMillan, formerly of the University of Toronto and a companion of the Order of Canada, is the author of Paris 1919, as well as The Uses and Abuses of History, among other books. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for listening. If you like what you heard today, subscribe to History Matters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. You can reach me or the members of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education by email at info@cihe.ca.